Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Stanka Willis, a past president of the Marine Technology Society. Along with MTS, these dialogues are being sponsored by the Global Ocean Observing System, GOOS, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, industry partners Kongsberg Discovery and L3 Harris, as well as the United States Integrated Ocean Observing System. This second dialogue with industry series, which focuses on harmful algal blooms. We welcome you and sincerely appreciate you joining us in the first of the three dialogues. Next slide. The OECD has predicted the ocean economy will reach $3 trillion in 2020, by 2030. And in 2022, the United States Department of Commerce found that the American blue economy already contributed about $361 billion to the nation's gross domestic product across 10 sectors, representing businesses dependent on the nation's oceans, coast, and Great Lakes. Understanding terminology is important. So we begin with the ocean enterprise. The ocean enterprise is different than the ocean economy and the blue economy. The ocean enterprise is that associated with the field of ocean observing, forecasting, and services. As depicted on this slide, the who are the entities within the public, private, and academic sectors. The what are the entities providing observational infrastructure, measurement, forecasting, and operational services. While the ocean enterprise industry sector is not consistently measured by economic statistical entities such as the OECD, three nations have conducted studies. The United States has conducted two studies in 2015 and 2020. The studies show a growing trend in both the revenue and numbers of businesses. In 2015, the revenue was $7 billion annually, and by 2020, this grew to $8 billion. The number of businesses grew by almost 60% for a total of 814. Canada and the United Kingdom have done similar studies, and the most recent figures for revenue are 1.9 billion Canadian and 1.6 billion British pounds, respectively. Next slide. The Ocean Enterprise Initiative, developed from the successful Dialogue with Industry series held between September 2022 and January 2023, and the subsequent development of the Dialogue with Industries roadmap. MTS received a grant from NOAA and IUS to build the Ocean Enterprise Initiative towards achieving the goals in the roadmap. The vision of this global effort is a flourishing ocean enterprise that is recognized as an integral market sector, grows a sustained ocean observing system, and changes the perception of ocean information from peripheral to essential to society. The Dialogues with Industry roadmap lays out three priority areas, which you see on the slide here, along with some of the types of activities under the initiative, such as these Dialogue with Industries. Next slide. The Ocean Information Value Chain is a framework to illustrate how ocean observations are converted through a wide range of interactions, transformation, and service delivery mechanisms to products that have value to decision makers and business leaders, and thus impact to society. Taking the value chain approach allows us to illustrate the importance of ocean information and related services. The graphic also visualizes the ocean enterprise and its interconnected components and activities across the ocean information value chain. The orange discs visualize the current level of private industry involvement in the segment, i.e., they offer an estimate of the current relative market size. The arrows indicate our estimate of private industry growth potential in each area where vertical is high. All market segments can benefit from innovation and can be commercially exploited. While this diagram is representative of the ocean enterprise writ large and not specific to harmful algal blooms, we have found that this has been a valuable way in which we can frame the discussions. Through these dialogues, we are hoping to better understand market aggregation and demand, opportunities to scale, and things that can foster innovation and speed to market. Today, we're going to focus on the left-hand side of this graphic. but we appreciate that the participants today likely categorize themselves in multiple components along this value chain. And as we build these dialogues, we will go through each part of the value chain. Next slide, please. So how is this different? The planning team has tried to craft these dialogues differently, and instead of a single panel or a session at many ocean venues and projects, which are all important, we have spent quite a bit of time curating 3 dialogues that will build on each other. We look forward to hearing from you on actionable recommendations, and our moderator will continue to push you in that direction. We also want to ensure representation from different sectors such as government, intergovernmental, private, academia, and different disciplines such as finance. We have limited the participants who can interact verbally with our moderator for logistic reasons. We are hoping that everyone on this call will enrich the conversation through the chat function and during the last 30 minutes of open discussion. Next slide. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Chris Ostrander, the CEO of MTS. You see his short bio on the screen, but additionally, Chris serves as the co-chair of the Oceans Research Advisory Panel, supporting the White House's cabinet-level Ocean Policy Committee effort to advance ocean research priorities, facilities, and domestic investment. Prior to MTS, Chris served in a range of leadership roles at the University of Utah, spanning technology, licensing and commercialization, industry partnerships, foundation, and corporate philanthropy. Before Utah, Chris served as the Assistant Dean and Director of Strategic Initiatives at the School of Ocean and Earth Sciences at the University of Hawaii. And while in Hawaii, he was the co-founder and director of the Pacific Islands Ocean Observing System, PAC-IUS, one of the regional associations under IUS. So once again, thank you very much for your participation. We are looking forward to a robust conversation. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Stanka, for the introduction. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to join you all for this first of 3 dialogues in our series on harmful algal blooms. For our invited participants, we ask that you keep your video on during the discussion, and I ask you to use the raise hand feature so I can call on you to share your thoughts with the group. In some cases, I may direct a question at a particular participant or a group of participants. In the interest of keeping the discussion moving, I probably will shift to a new question before I've been able to call on everyone who raises their hand. So I apologize in advance to anyone that I cut short or that I miss. In the interest of time, I'm not going to introduce our invited participants. Instead, I ask everyone to please tell folks your name, your role, and your organization when you speak for the first time. For those in the audience, please listen to the conversation, type your questions or thoughts in the Q&A for everyone to see. And you can also layer in feedback to the questions or comments posted by everybody else. As usual, please keep your microphone on mute when you're not speaking. Our conversation today is divided into 4 sessions. We've set aside about 30 minutes for questions and discussion in each of the first 3 sessions, with a short break in between. Depending on how the conversation is going, I may shorten or extend the sessions, and our final session will be open discussion among both our participants and our observers. Please note that this dialogue, the Q&A, and the chat are all being recorded and will be made publicly available in the coming weeks. The content of the session report, though, will not include attribution to the comments or questions of any participant. So let's have fun, let's have a robust discussion, and let's get started. Our first session is focused on the development and commercialization of HAB sensors and platforms, inclusive of lab-based, point-of-use, and in-situ systems. As our collective awareness of the spatial and temporal occurrence and impact of HABs has grown over the past few decades, so too has the collective need, spanning industry, regulators, health managers, and society, for observing technologies that enable prediction, prevention, control, and mitigation of the impacts of HABs. Development of sensors and the integration of those sensors in uncrewed platforms and fixed platforms at sufficient geographical scales is needed to support real-time decision-making at scale. The market for HAB sensors and platforms continues to form and grow. with consistent and predictable demand for and the supply of ubiquitous, cost-effective, reliable, easy-to-use multi-target sensing systems still to be realized. So the first question for everyone, considering the current landscape, what economic and regulatory forces are driving growth in the HAB sensor and platform market today? And what challenges exist in shaping and sustaining that growth into the future? Please raise your hand and we can dive right in.
Casey, take down the slide set, please.
Maxwell, please go for it.
Yeah, hi, Max at Hog Island Oyster Company. I think the biggest challenge is, at least in the oyster industry, is interpreting these results to farmers and how they affect them. Obviously, cost is a huge barrier to entry as well. We have some sensor platforms that we were lucky enough to work with some existing grants and researchers on. So we're a very unique case that we have sensors in the first place. Um, and I mean, just these red tide monitoring networks are voluntary for most farms anyways. I mean, from a regulatory perspective, they have to submit samples to a lab, but those labs and regulatory agencies don't necessarily interpret the results for the farmers as well. Um, I think interpretation and cost is probably the biggest barrier to entry. Most farmers are like, does it affect next week? They're thinking about next week. They're thinking about next month. Um, Obviously, these HAB events can pop up at any time, but it's not at the front of their mind because they're not seeing those results and they don't know how to understand them. So,
Can you talk a little bit more about cost, Max? And are you thinking, upfront commercialization cost, the purchase cost? Is this ongoing maintenance and operation? How do you think about the cost limitation?
yeah, so we work with a company in the Bay Area that's a lake management company, and they're great because they do an all-in-one cost with a portal that they automatically upload all the data to and organize so that it's very easy for everyone at the company to interpret. But that costs about $12,000 per year, and uh, if that wasn't subsidized by a grant, even our company, which is one of the larger oyster farms, we would probably still not find it useful enough to pay for. Um, as far as HABs go, uh, it really is our specific regulatory agency, California Department of Public Health, that is interpreting the results for us. The sensor doesn't really detect our HAB events. I mean, it detects elevated chlorophyll, but um, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a HAB event there. So, yeah, just cost of the sensors, cost of maintenance, cost of data management, it is very high for farmers, and I think it's a big reason why the these farmers aren't buying it themselves. But I'm sure there's a lot of farmers who would be very happy to host these sensors and participate in them if they had like resources to interpret it for them.
Thanks, Max. So we've heard one perspective on what's driving the market here, and that's a demand signal from farmers and via regulators to have real-time information for decision making in aquaculture. What else do folks see that's driving, whether it's an economic driver or regulatory driver, on growth in the market? Chris.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And
My raise hand function does not seem to be there no matter what.
Okay.
So I apologize for interrupting. One of the challenges that I see on the market side is the niche aspect of HAB. And I think to the extent that one considers, once you grab a water sample, which you are probably doing, or you're looking at the water microscopically in some capacity or fluorometrically, you're doing other things besides looking for HABs. And so I think if we thought of this market as more, a broader perspective of monitoring and management, that actually increases the share and utility of the sensors that we're using, as opposed to this very niche, do I have a specific bug? Do I have a specific toxin? I mean, that's really important stuff. But to the extent you can federate that and include more information, make that same sampling, the same observation, more information rich, the greater the value in that data. And in that case, in a fee for service type of situation, which was just described, it actually makes it probably cheaper than to sell that information to different groups.
Thanks, Chris. We'll go to Yuki next, but first, I think if everyone clicks under reactions, you should see the raise hand feature pop up at the bottom of your screen. It's buried and hidden, but hopefully you find it there. Yuki, go ahead.
Yuki Honjo, McLean Research Labs. We are a manufacturer of ocean instrumentation. And one of the things that we noticed is that while there is funding for proof of concept instrumentation within the lab, commercialization for things like HABs or things that go into the ocean is actually a big step. Oftentimes people have the mindset of thinking about it like computer programming. You finish the beta test, you finish the alpha test, do a little bit of beta testing, and it's ready to go. It's not the case for ocean instrumentation. Ocean instrumentation has to go into complex environments, in difficult environments, and it actually takes a lot of time. In addition, that if it's going somewhere very remote, there's a bottleneck of people who can actually take that instrumentation to sea. You can't throw money at the problem and increase productivity. So there is a bottleneck. Time scales are much longer than, let's say, standard developments and going to market in, let's say, compared to biotech or software.
Thanks, Yuki. So we'll go to Judson and then David, and then I'm going to ask a follow-up question that goes a bit deeper on this one.
Excellent, thank you. I'm Judson Jevin. I'm at Saab, and I'm a mechanical engineer. We produce ROVs and AUVs. So I think that Maxwell and Chris brought up a couple of things that I think are pretty critical to the discussion. One thing that Maxwell said I found key is not have limited resources on the demand side, right? So regulatories might have something in place, but if the people using the information don't have the resources to procure the instrumentation or maintain it, the labor required, then that shows basically like a risk on the demand side from an industry perspective, because basically if there's no perceived market, or if the people who need this don't have the money, there's not going to be investment from industry. And what Yuki just said sort of reinforces that, right? Because essentially you need the data to drive policy. You need the policy for like the regulation that's going to drive demand, and that demand drives the perceived market, which is going to increase investment, and that increase in investment lowers unit costs and hopefully lowers the thresholds into the technology. So to Chris's point, I think that there probably is a broader discussion in using this data for sort of from a multi-faceted perspective to try and diversify the use case of that data, which inherently increases its value.
Yeah, it's a great point. David, over to you.
Yeah, one driver that I think should be highlighted, because unfortunately it's not always covered by regulatory or market-based demand structures, is that where we're seeing increasing need, and that's in rural and remote communities, particularly around subsistence use of marine resources. These are communities that do not have access to high-tech testing capacities or laboratories. These are communities that are wholly reliant at times on marine resources, and unfortunately, oftentimes get left behind from both regulatory structures and market demands. And so one of the challenges that we're trying to weave through on the federal side, and I should introduce myself in a second when I'm done speaking, is how do we incentivize that, and how do we build that capacity to be more inclusive of subsistence and cultural uses where we're seeing increasing impacts and issues associated with HAB toxins and occurrences. And then for the introduction, I'm Dave Kidwell. I'm with NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science. I also co-chair the Interagency Working Group for HABs and hypoxia, which kind of helps try to coordinate federal activities on this topic.
Thanks, David. So I want to pull a thread that David and Judd and Chris all sort of touched on, and that's really about this aggregation and standardization of demand. So we can set a sort of a benchmark that markets respond favorably to predictable demand signals from large customer bases. And for the HAB sensor and platform market, government agencies, whether they're local or national or even inclusive international bodies, are a primary customer. And so the question is for folks on both the supply and the demand side of this equation, what challenges or barriers exist for the government customer, David, to your point, and other customers communicating aggregated requirements for sensors and instruments to those who are supplying them? And how do these barriers be overcome? Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, folks. No matter what I do, I can't get a raise hand function on my screen. So I'm going analog. I think one of the real challenges is in really understanding the regional aspects, because each region is slightly different and the regulatory environment is slightly different. And so each of these areas is kind of customized, whereas we think about aggregating an ability to detect algal toxin, or I want to be able to identify the species or something. That doesn't really play out in necessarily very well in a regional operational context. And so when you get to that granularity, I think for the agencies, let's say they are the primary customer, or maybe it's a shellfish culture, aquaculture installation or whatever. The question really kind of comes down to, do I want to be owner operator of this equipment, or is it better just to have a fee for service? What is the most economic value I get? And I think that's a question that's often not asked. And so in the case of NOAA, what could be done is to really look at the research to operations transition and understand, where regionally, where does the best value lie? That's a suggestion.
Thanks, Chris. Yuki.
Building on what Chris said, just in terms of the instrumentation that we build, there's a lot of data products, and the data needs a home. And in addition to that, there is a networking effect, not just with our instrumentations, but to understand HABs overall. A single point is not as useful as 3 or 30 or 300. And managing that data and sharing that data, and having a home for that data is a huge question, and one that, I think for the government customer, something that needs to have money and funds and thought put into that.
Thanks, Yuki. Philip, and then Leanne.
Yeah, just picking up from Chris Golin's thread on making the point that things are different in different regions. I think US and Europe are very different in terms of regulations. But just to give a feeling for what are maybe barriers for government customers, I think even though this might sound paradoxical, governments also have funding problems, and maybe particularly since COVID, and particularly more recently with various big events that are a drag on government expenditure, war in Ukraine and so on. So there's lots of reasons why government also has cost issues with some of the more cost-intensive systems to maintain. But I think even more importantly than additional drag on government expenditure on such systems is that whenever government thinks about a new system to implement, they need to see, can I drop my old system, or do I want to drop my old system and start with a new system? How can I have a system which I've run for the last 30, 40 years stop and taken over by a new system? Because that's discontinuity of data. Yeah, when you think about the use of data long term, any rupture in how the data is collected and supplied, that's a big stumbling block. How do I provide continuancy of my data collection and not introduce ruptures to this data collection? And then can I actually afford an additional system? If I want to provide a continuity, I continue with my old system, which is very comprehensive, microscopic observations or so, by man-made observations, which can detect literally hundreds of different species to species level or to genus level. And so most governments actually see that they cannot simply drop the old system, but need to complement with the new technologies. And that's where then the cost effectiveness is often queried. So I think that's a huge barrier, data continuity and additional costs. It's not just a replacement, because you have to maintain the data continuity, and therefore it's an additional cost. And when you're looking at cost savings programs, additional costs are not good news. So I think that's one major barrier, but it's just sort of a general typical view. Yeah, it's maybe more important so in Europe, because in Europe a lot of monitoring is actually government driven, but I'd like to hear more on that aspect also from countries which are quite progressive, like Dave Clark in Ireland and so on. And maybe in South America, people can also complement this view. So curious to hear about that.
That's a good point, Philip, and it's one that we see across the ocean observing spectrum as new technologies come online, is this question of data continuity and data legacy. Okay, we'll go to Leanne and then Clarissa.
This circles back to Yuki's good point about where will this data live. These are very large data sets. In addition to providing a central location where those data sets can be housed, the development and implementation of universal standardization of how that data is organized would also be a significant consideration. And how do we implement or communicate those standards?
No, good point. And I just want to note too, as we start to get deeper into this conversation, there's going to be a lot of directions and a lot of threads, and we're not going to be able to chase all of them down. So if I don't bring them up, please feel free, as Leanne just did, to circle back to somebody else's point and layer further on it. Clarissa.
Hi, Clarissa Anderson. I'm at Scripps and director of an ocean observing system here in Southern California, as well as a cooperative institute for NOAA. Getting to what I think is becoming a common theme in these comments is the role of the public sector. And I know that's going to come out in future questions that you have, Chris, and that's not exactly what you asked. It does seem to be like a big lever here, and where the continuity really comes into play. And even, the drivers of requirements is the academic side of this. And I heard it in the opening comments, which were, how do we work with shellfish growers and other industry partners who do not have the finances for that sort of continuity and translation? And so I just want to make a plug that I think maybe we really do need to focus on helping industry by making the critical case to Congress that these sustained observations are important, because the most continuous and consistent investment has been from the public sector, federal government in the US, driving the need for these instruments. And then those academic and public partners realizing that the only way to make these data relevant, even if they have burning science questions, is to work with those who need the on-the-ground, real-time regional information. So I think that will always be a driver, and that service delivery is always going to be pushed very much, I think, by the science questions that lead to standards that are stringent and climate quality, and then allow us to make operational decisions. Thanks.
No, thank you. So we'll get through the next three. We've got Zoe, Matt, and then Mark, and then I'm going to go in a slightly different direction.
Thank you, Chris. I'm Zoe Constantino. I work for the European Commission, the Directorate General of Maritime Affairs and Fisheries, and I'm actually managing the European Marine Observation and Data Network, which is a good practice for the European Union in terms of sharing data under common standards. There is a lot of work done there, but I want to go back into the observing capacity and the market demand that in Europe comes in truth more from public sector, because it's the public sector that has a very specific responsibility towards food safety and towards human safety. And for us in the European Union, there is a fragmentation of the market, because besides the fact of the existence of the Commission and the Union, each member state has its own observing systems and its own observing capacity. And then very often they procure for observing equipment on their own. And a solution that doesn't cover only harmful algal blooms, but in this case is very relevant for us, is to have a better understanding of the observing needs and the observing capabilities of the member states, and see if the different member states can come together with common needs to ask for the development of equipment that is going to cover different regulatory needs, because many of the regulatory needs are common because of the existence of the Common Commission regulatory framework. And this is an effort that we're trying to do. We have to underline, because nobody said it until now, that harmful algal blooms and in general biological observations have the problem of geographical differences that are making observation even more complicated compared to physical oceanography, for instance. But this may be something that for us, at least in European seas, can be covered by 3 or 4 different approaches, we think. It's a perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe. And it goes back to, I think, the point that Chris Schollen raised earlier about this regional variability and this lack of heterogeneity in what folks are dealing with. Matt, and then Mark, and then we'll go a different direction.
So I'm Matt Molam from the National Oceanography Centre in the UK, and I've recently headed up a big European project which included technology development for this application. So I think my perspective is that one of the barriers is the potential dialogue with regulators. I think it's really important that developers and innovators are having a discussion with regulators, because some techniques are unlikely to be acceptable as relevant data. And so, in the European context, we've been talking to taxonomists working on microscopy images, the standard method. We've got very advanced laboratory methods for looking at algal toxins. And we need to have that discussion about, well, will nucleic acid analysis or biosensors be able to complement or replace any of that data? And if they're going to run alongside, that's a harder challenge economically, because then you've really got to be able to add significant value by making those extra measurements. And maybe that comes about. Maybe you can detect harmful algal bloom early onset easier, or you get better temporal resolution than very infrequent sampling. But I think that dialogue with the regulators is really important to focus the innovation efforts.
That's a really good point, Matt. It's what I'm going to loop back to in a little while on a different question around sort of toxin rapid testing. Mark, over to you.
Actually, that was a good segue. I'm Mark Van Asten, CEO of Phytoxygen, manufacturer of nucleic acid assays related to HABs. And both Phil, Max, and sorry, I forgot the last speaker, but I wanted to, I suppose, emphasize that point. Our business generally fluctuates with government funding for projects. So there's feast and famine when it comes to actually sustaining a business. And the growers or the industry, as in the impacted individuals, really do have a limitation on how they can utilize the technology once it's either validated scientifically through the regulatory system. And again, want to emphasize, or what Phil's point was, is there is a cost addition, not a cost benefit. And that's difficult for people to then transition to regular use of any of the technology.
Good point. Leonardo, do you want to jump in on this one before we move to a different topic?
Sorry, I kind of raised my hand, so can I have a few minutes?
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I'm Leonardo Guzman from the Fisheries Development Institute and from Chile. And we are in charge of the monitoring programs along a huge area from 36 degrees up to 55 degrees, covering a huge area of the Humboldt Current affected area and all the Chilean fjords. So my comments on the question you introduced are related to first something that had been already mentioned by Philip and Sue, that and Soy, that there are many differences. So the technology that you should select for specific cases is associated to the type of HAB that you have in your specific area and the geographic features associated to where you're going to use the technology. Also, the cultural background is very important. And from the political point of view, say how the governance is already structured, how to take decisions from the public sector. It's very different from a federal country than if we consider a unitary country as is Chile and many countries in South America. And also the cultural background, it is very important from the point of view of the public consideration associated to technology, how it is utilized, and how this information will be useful for the community as a whole. And also the private sector, probably for selecting technology, will move much more faster than the public sector. But because of that, also you could have some selection of technology that it is not appropriate for the conditions that you are going to apply that technology. So that is very important to be considered as well. And from the other side, from the public sector, the problem is just the opposite. Normally, they take too much time to take a decision because always they are trying to maintain something that was mentioned by Philip, that the time series, if you change the quality of information or the type of information that you will be collecting with new technology, probably you cannot use that information to try to have a better comprehension of what is happening with HAB and how to try to control it, mitigate it, or trying to have early warnings or forecasting the HAB. So the decision of and how the market will move associated to this subject will depend on the geographic area and the possibility if some countries have any they could get engaged trying to have similar solutions, but that is associated to the geography and the how near the countries associated to the structure associated to international relationships. It is very different in Europe than to South America or Latin America, and that is important for the market as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm gonna come back to some of the threads that have been raised, but I'm gonna go a totally different direction now. I'm gonna pull a thread that Yuki and others brought up on both data management being a big challenge here, but also the counterpoint that data from multiple sites is better than data from a single point when trying to manage the occurrence of HABs. So how successful has the integration of sensors with uncrewed platforms been for detection and monitoring of both species as well as toxins? And what's limiting further adoption and innovation of these coupled systems? Chris.
Well, I think it's a pretty bespoke situation when it comes to integration of these detection systems in autonomous platforms. It is certainly happening. It's not widespread. That would include things like autonomous surface vessels of a variety of classes, autonomous underwater vehicles, and I think even a profiling float that Matt Molam had worked on. So it's there. And I think one of the challenges is those platforms are not cheap. And if your sole, application is to go out and do HAB seeking, then, it becomes an expensive proposition. And technologically, it's not, super easy. It requires expert users, and for the most part. And so also, the nature of the data that you're acquiring could pose some challenges. So if you're doing an optical type of assessment microscope, you need edge computing to do the data processing, because uploading all those images could be challenging. If you're doing any kind of molecular analytical analysis, that's also challenging, and maybe the data is easier to get back, but the machine is more complex. So I think it's really a question. Again, I would circle back as to what's the value proposition of the autonomous platform. A lot of these bugs that we're after might be hiding in layers below the surface water. You want to move around in the water column, particularly in the open ocean. Even in lakes or shallow water systems, it's patchy. It's not always in one spot, so you need to be able to do a seek and find. We've done a lot of that work. But I guess my final comment is, what could we do to get more out of that data or the samples we're acquiring than just a HAB species?
Matt, and then Jigger.
Well, I think it's probably still true that there's relatively few successful integrations of HABs, HAB detection on autonomy. I'm aware of a few. There's been cytometry put on, cytometers put onto autonomous subs, and there's been a limited amount of larger sort of nucleic acid. There's quite a lot of fluorescence used to monitor HABs, but then that might not be as specific as some of the other approaches. But what it suggests to me is that we need to do more of those kind of demonstrations with the technology that's near to market, or in the academic communities, or close enough to get us some demonstration projects, even if that vehicle and that sensor pairing isn't really the optimal in terms of cost, weight, power, and all the rest of it. But we could demonstrate the application and work with stakeholders to make sure that we were targeting the right requirements. So yeah, I think unfortunately still relatively few functional demonstrators of the combined autonomy and sensors for HABs at high fidelity.
Thanks, Matt. Jigger, and then Mark.
Yeah. Hi, so my name is Jigger Herman. I'm with C-Track in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and we are one of the companies that make the platform. And I think what Chris said earlier is sort of right on the money. It's really early days of integrating these two things. And I think I know a lot more about the boat than I know about the sensors, but from our perspective here, it's both the vehicles and the sensors are quite expensive, and so they're both on a course to, I think, come down in price. But right now, they're both quite costly, and they're both complicated to run. We've been involved in a couple different projects, and I would say the longest one was several months with HUI and their IFCB. But we're familiar with working with the ESP, and we've done some work with the guys at NOAA. I think some of the other issues that come into play, Chris mentioned one of them, which is that the sensing on the surface with a boat, which is what we do for now, it gets you the surface, and that's great, but it may not be everything you need. And so I think working on being able to get different layers is important. With our involvement with HUI, I think we've been exposed to some other important issues. Sensing out in the open water requires obviously going out there, which opens up a whole slew of other issues around piloting the vehicle. And so I think going forward, these projects will help to explore, whether it's, owner operated models. In the case of Hui, they own 3 vehicles of ours that they operate on their own. And the downside is that they need to staff them and pilot them themselves. The other way to go at it, there's other companies like ours, and we do too, where we can, operate the boats for people. And I think going forward in the years ahead, I think we'll see these prices come down. The operation is complicated by the rules of the road, call regs, other vehicles, where are you? We've had an unpleasant incident where a pleasure boater ran into one of our vehicles. And that's a real problem. And I think, this is going to happen in the future. The pleasure boaters run into things all the time. And so I think we're learning, and I think these things will go forward. To also echo something Chris said, I think finding projects where you can get a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 is important. And so we've also done a fair amount of work, and I think these platforms are very well suited for hypoxia mapping. And so down in the Gulf of Mexico, we've seen success there too. So that's kind of my quick take on sort of where we've seen things happen and where it could go.
Thanks, Jigar. Mark, and then Yuki.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of add that we seem to sort of put a single question to a project or otherwise, or mapping a certain problem. And again, some of the questions or responses have been related to around, we've got a very complex questions with many either different toxins or different situations. Ultimately, any of the data that's acquired or otherwise, I think it'd be important to integrate a number of the different technologies or ideas and map out algorithms that actual stakeholders can use. I mean, what happens when you have a gene in the water? What testing frequency? If you don't, can I not test? Really actionable items that either regulatory people can get behind, or some cost modeling could actually demonstrate there is some utility in adopting the technology. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Yuki, and then we'll do, I'll pull Chris in because he sent me a message as well because he had a question. So Yuki, go ahead. Oh, you're muted, Yuki.
I think I'd be used to this by now. In our experience, we've been working with the PhytoArm, which is Mike Brosnahan's kind of mobile HAB platform. But it remains very much a science-driven and non-industry platform, and it's great. But we are always going up against power, communication, cost, and expertise, and that's what makes these platforms very, very difficult. One of the ways we've been getting around it, and it's not autonomous, but we've been taking advantage. A lot of scientists have been taking advantage of ships of opportunity, ferries, and just sticking instrumentation on these ships and collecting HAB information, and thus lowering costs that way rather than going for the full autonomous platform.
Good point. So final comments from both Chris and then Philip, and then we're going to take a short break and get right back at it.
Thanks, Chris. I just, with respect to improving industry engagement, I think we have to broaden our perspective. Let's think about this in terms of maritime domain awareness, if we're talking about the oceans, the coasts. If you start to do that, you're talking about multi-robotic systems, autonomous surface craft cooperating with autonomous underwater vehicles to do coordinated, targeted observations. That's exactly what we need for harmful algal bloom surveillance. But you can't justify that very easily on a HAB basis only. There's not enough money in the market. There's no return on investment. So it remains bespoke, remains researchy, very niche. And to Matt's point, great for demonstration. It shows the technology, but who's really the customer? And at the end of the day, if you're going to have autonomous systems that are able to understand what's going on in the environment, react, sample, do something, report data, that's something that's much more interesting to the defense, maritime domain awareness industry than it is this niche, HAB thing. Just my comment.
Good comment, Chris. Philip, last word.
Well, I didn't properly introduce, and that's maybe because I'm wearing several hats here, without having a nice one like Jigger. But the first reply I made was with my hat on as an IFREMER scientist. IFREMER is a government agency running the National Monitoring Program for France. So I was a little bit critical from that point of view. I'm also currently chairing the Intergovernmental Panel on Harmful Algal Blooms, where we've had a reflection on how to advance, as we say it in IOC terms, the knowledge you need for the ocean you want. And that's why we created an UN Ocean Decade Action on HAB solutions. And I think the discussions we're having here are exactly in the spirit of that program. We need to define the needs of all the stakeholders and then activate the scientists, the governments, and so on to actually get to those needs. So this is something like we have ocean technology to do weather forecast. Actually, IFREMER maintains a very large number of detectors which are in the Argos system, where we have detectors in the water placed all over over half of the Atlantic Ocean, which go into all of the weather forecasts. And ideally, we need a concerted effort to take this rupture science. You know, Glycera has explained it very well. She's running an NCCOS observational program, which has the luxury of putting several costly systems in the ocean. That only works because it is also of scientific interest in explaining the dynamics of those blooms. If we want to make the jump from just scientists making the most of this information into providing this information on large scale, regional scale, like all US or all Europe or all South America, we need to get our funding agencies to realize that there is a jump into hyperspace to be made. There is some investment to be made. And from that point of view, in order to provide both data continuity and rupture progress, we need to clearly get substantial funding amounts into US economies, EU economies, to actually pioneer these systems to a larger scale. You know, we're running exactly those things for tsunami forecasting, for weather forecasting, but we're not running them for HAB forecasting. So by actually making a network of such observational systems, we can gain momentum to provide this at a larger scale. In EU, it's already government provided, but to change from one system into another system is going to be a major effort. You know, so that's the message to Zoe Constantinou, to comprise this into DG research comments on larger research efforts that might actually eventually lead to coordinated observational systems. You know, so as it stands at the moment, the barriers are too big for individual governments to take this forward. But once we have coordinated research funding towards such introduction of new systems, then it can be done. You know, so that's my point of view as the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel of Harmful Algal Blooms, and with a little bit of a twist at EU level as well.
No, thank you, Philip. So we're just gonna keep going. We're gonna merge right into session 2 here, and we're gonna skip the break. Feel free to drop off for a couple minutes if you need to. I do promise you we'll take a break before we get to the top of the hour. But I want to pull back in Holly, if you wanted to jump in and continue the thread you had started here. I know I had cut you off earlier in the list, and then we'll go to Ilya and Zoe.
No worries. Thank you. Good morning. So Holly Bowers, research faculty at Moss Landing Marine Lab. So I'm solidly from the academic side, and I just wanted to sort of tack on the comment about, I know we talked about patchiness, but also when it comes to speaking with regulators or getting public interest or input, all of that, we have to remember, at least in the US, we don't always have thresholds set for toxin levels and what's considered that line when things are crossing a threshold, really. So that challenges things as well, because if you have a platform that can, or a sensor that can detect X amount of toxin, what does that mean when you put it into the framework of what is regulated? And so if there is no number for that, then you're kind of lost and everybody's kind of sitting around waiting for that number, or, you know, how low can you go with the sensor? And so there's a lot of discussion around that. So I just wanted to sort of add that into the mix of our thoughts.
Thank you. Ilya.
Yeah, I am from Israel Oceanographic and Limnological Research Institute, and my group is dealing with cyanobacteria blooms in different lakes and locations. And I want to raise some questions about sensors and customers. Actually, they need to know what they need this sensor for. If they have some kind of numbers and they don't know how to interpret the data, what they can get from the data, they don't need sensors, especially if the cost is not very small. So, and I want to talk about that HABs are very complex phenomena and many factors affecting different kind of species and groups. And our study, for instance, shows that there are several factors such as physical phenomena, turbulence, stratification, and of course, effect on light, availability of group, ability to be in the photic zone. So what I want to stress that when we're talking about sensor, we don't need only to understand what kind of pigments and toxins, but we need to understand and really understand what factors, how factors affect on bloom of cyanobacteria. And this required to integration many sensor, including physical sensor, including microstratification, especially for cyanobacteria. It's very important to know daily diurnal stratification and turbulence. And when turbulence suppress some buoyant algae or free swimming algae can swim up and form blooms. Also, very important things that all these physical factors affect on on nutrient supply to the algae and also effect on patchiness. So if we have good information about and understanding what kind of species can be affected, how system works, then customers, and we have models integrated together with sensors. So we have kind of predicting models that work. Then, of course, to predict, to deal with harmful algae, customers will definitely, many customers will immediately just will need this kind of sensors because they know, okay, we will buy this sensor, we buy the complex of sensors, but we can get real results. We can deal with blooms, we can predict blooms, we will know what to do and how to do. This is just some kind of idea we need to discuss because people need to have some kind of profit from this sensor. They need to have feeling. So this is the integration of science and technology. And of course, we will be very glad to support and help with development of such a system. Thank you.
Oh, good points, Ilya. Thank you. Zoe, do you want to jump in on this one? I saw your hand was raised.
I wanted to reply to Philip, and I think that it's not relevant to start a European discussion right now. But I want to say that we have to find a way to get beyond what is for academic use and for what is for industry use, because in the end of the day, and on what Ilya just said regarding profit is not only profit. Profit sometimes is also avoiding damages. And we have quite a lot of evidence that the damages are there, and we need to find a way to avoid them. And this is also, avoiding costs is also adding to benefits. And in European waters, you will see that through regulation, beaver farming is very much affected by this, because the European regulation is very strict, and it inhibits selling of anything if there are harmful algal blooms. And in some areas, this can take months to be resolved. So we have to find a way to move away from the academic and industry discussion and find a common space.
Good point. You're right. The avoidance of cost is certainly a societal benefit here. I want to aggregate a couple of things that folks have said into sort of one bigger question. And this will be probably the last sort of demand side question I have for a bit. So pulling a thread that Clarissa and Philip and Chris and Ilya sort of all touched on, and this is really a question I'd love to hear folks on the industry side give some perspective on. Is the potential end user market for HAB sensors and platforms both broad and clear enough to generate the revenue you need to grow and sustain your business? And if not, what needs to be done to identify, to activate, and to aggregate that consumer base? Mark. Oh, you're muted.
I was going to say the simple answer to that is yes, but I mean, related to a number of comments or feedback that's been given, stakeholders are either too small to afford some of these technologies or the investment in the equipment. They're reluctant potentially of putting together a consortium or to look after a certain region. They're looking to government, to academia, for funding of these technologies without really a firm knowledge of how that investment from the government side is going to work into their working models to develop cost effectiveness. And then, of course, the regulatory side of it, without sort of a firm direction where these can be implemented with clear criteria for use or application, the applications drop off or the interest dies.
Max, and then Judd.
Yeah, in the oyster industry, I mean, most farms are so small that regulatory costs are already a barrier to entry into getting an oyster farm in the first place. So if these HAB events increase in frequency and these technologies become necessary and not subsidized, then it'll just be a barrier into farming in general. And you'll see a lot of smaller farmers who are already closing shop partially due to regulatory costs will just continue to do so.
Judson and then Matt.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a pretty complex question. I think the end user market is probably broad enough. I think from the clear enough perspective, that's debatable. I've heard a couple times throughout this, like inconsistency in interpretation, no standardization of data. For industry, right, everything that drives what we do comes from derived requirements. We need to know exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it and what we're delivering. And it sounds like that's going to come from the regulatory side, but one thing that Leonardo pointed out was that the private sector moves faster than the public sector. So a lot of this, industry might be able to do something quicker, but if the public sector isn't updating their requirements to allow these new technologies to be used, it limits the customer base that we can aggregate. So this is coming back to Chris Schoenland's point of trying to maybe use these systems in a dual use capacity for maritime domain awareness. But this all ties back to that to the generating the revenue needed to establish and grow and sustain a business. Do we know that? I would say no, because we don't know what funds the end user market can generate. Right? Like if they have limited resources, then I think the only way to make these sensors and platforms cost effective is trying to get a lot of these customers together in the first place to lower the cost, because to Max's point, one farm isn't going to have enough to start this process. It might be tens, it might be hundreds. I don't know.
No, good points. So I'm going to circle back to that in a second, but Matt, go ahead.
It's some great points. I'll try and build on those a little bit. I think there is a bit of a cost paradox here. We could expand use by driving cost down, but to do that, we're going to need more investment, because broadly cheaper to deploy sensors cost more to develop, and they're going to then need to sell in much larger volumes to justify doing that. So there is that cost paradox that we need to get over. One possible solution is these adjacent markets. We talked about defense. I think if we can do some of the detection methods at low cost and scale, they might bleed into things like public health, pathogen monitoring and other things where there might be a much larger market. And that's, wearing my hat as a company director as well, selling sensors, not for HABs yet, but that's the kind of thing that can drive volume enough that the price will come down for the oceanographic or the harmful algal bloom markets. I think we also should be clear that there are some significant offset costs for HABs. I'm aware of a few incidents where HABs have cost finfish industries hundreds of millions of dollars, and so that economic driver may come from certain segments of the HAB interested markets. But I think there are a few, but they're not very good and they're not very current. What would drive industry to address some of these things is better market information, a clearer disposition of the regulations, so we all know what we're up against, and some discussions with the community about what would be reasonable routes to market. Sorry, there's a few points there, but hopefully that helps.
No, there's a lot there. That's good. And I want to jump in with a question then, Philip. You're welcome to pick up this thread or jump to the new one. A few folks, Mark and Max and Judd and others, have mentioned subsidization. And I'm curious how folks feel about where subsidies can fit in here, where public sector subsidies can fit in. Is it on the consumer side, as we talked about very early on, in sustaining equipment at the point scale, let's say a farm, to measure and monitor? Is it in the form of SBIRs, STTRs with companies to bring new technology to market? Where are the right points and what are the right mechanisms that folks feel from a public sector investment standpoint that cash should be put into the system to grow and form this market to the point where it's sustainable? Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I think what we heard from Max and others is that a lot of the shellfish businesses are too small to make those investments. It's also not sustainable, and I join Zoe. Okay, we cannot all be the state provider for all the information and all the costs to be put in, and the EU can't do that for them, the EU nations, and NOAA can't do it for the American states. It's not sustainable. So we need to be innovative. There is a very broad range of end users. The shellfish farmers I mean, sanitary closure of a shellfish production area is not a net loss, because the shellfish typically survive and can be sold 6 weeks later. It's not a net loss. So, you know, the harmful algal bloom does not justify a major investment for a shellfish farmer to stay in business. Obviously, if there's too many closures, eventually smaller firms will go bust, of course. But there is a very large range of end users, and I like Zoe's comment about doing damage limitation. And that this was also mentioned in the fish farming sectors are actually, they're not regulated for sanitary closures, but they make these millions of dollars or euros worth of losses in one event. They're rare events, but they're very, very damaging. So there is clearly a variety of end users to which this concerted, coordinated ocean observation, monitoring, and data keeping is beneficial. So we need to be also innovative. The governments can't pay for it all, but the governments could very well run the system, because they have the capacity of running data collections and data maintenance and output websites where the end users can benefit from the data. But for the system to be sustainable and for us to make this jump into hyperspace to actually take on the innovative novel technology, we need more money going into the system. So I'm wondering whether we couldn't think of piloting, and if I'm looking for EU funding, then it's not to fund the novel technologies just for all EU states, but to pilot case studies where we can show that consortia of end users can actually have a kind of tax and credit system. You know, a smaller firm will make a smaller contribution, but will make a contribution, and a bigger firm with much bigger gains and much bigger damage loss, damage to be avoided, will make bigger contributions. Actually, somebody asked earlier whether there's insurance companies providing backup for these disasters, which HABs are disaster management. And I think for fish farms, there is actually still insurance companies, whereas for shellfish farms, there isn't, in the EU at least. I don't know how the situation is in US or elsewhere, but we should really think about case studies where end user consortia define the needs and provide, together with academia and government, sufficient funding to put systems in place. And maybe if we can credibly make these case studies, for which maybe a little bit of extra funding is required, then we can actually make better use of these disruptive technologies, which will make it into the longer future. Because I think our shellfish farmers also have to tackle a lot of other issues about raising sea levels and so on. So there's a lot of financial hardship going to come for many of the end users, but we need to have innovative systems to coordinate this and to get coordinated data back to the end users. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you. So we're going to go with Matt, and then Fiona, and then Leanne, and then I'm going to go a different direction.
Thanks. So as an introduction, my name is Matt Clark. I'm with Poseidon Ocean Systems. We're a technology company based in Canada, and one of our main product lines is HAB mitigation systems. So I wanted to comment on some of this talk about market scale and that sort of thing, and the cost associated with this product development essentially is what we're talking about. So our focus is on finfish and mainly on salmon aquaculture, and that's because of the value and the scale of those operations. As it's been mentioned, HAB events have led to headline grabbing impacts of close to $1 billion in some incidences. But I'd like to point out that they're not rare. in the salmon farming industry internationally, HAB events are a daily occurrence, and monitoring and accurately identifying those HAB, both incidents and incoming threats, is a significant area of technology investment in those industries, or in that industry. And I can say that we've worked with both shellfish and finfish, and there's no question the shellfish industry that we've dealt with does not have the scale or the resources. And as the point was made, they also don't have the threat. As you say, the shellfish farm has to wait to harvest, whereas a finfish farm threatened by a HAB event could be faced with no harvest after a 4-year investment in the livestock. So it's interesting here. I mean, we're Canadian, we're Canada-based with international offices, and none in the United States. So being that this, forum is facilitated by American, NOAA and some of the other groups, that sort of thing, it's interesting because from outside the United States and seeing with this international panel, we have this other industry that is financially motivated to sort out this problem and is moving as quickly as I think you can expect technology to move in that scenario. And there's an opportunity for that collaboration and that technology development, whether it's associated with the harmful toxins that maybe regulatory or public health agencies are worried about. The technology is typically the same, whether they're identifying a particular HAB that's harmful to a finfish. That technology typically will transfer to be able to identify a HAB that is a threat to public health on beaches and that sort of thing. So the collaboration and the technology sourcing or opportunities, I think, typically, for us, for a private company, capitalist motivations and all the sort, we turn our focus to the industries or the communities that suffer the most significant financial impact from a HAB event, because those are the ones that are most strongly motivated to develop these technologies. So as we talk about collaboration and talk about solutions, that's from us on the outside, not relying on grants, not being able to rely on policy to drive demand. That's where we have to see these opportunities and paths to success. So I think that's something that should be considered when we're talking about how government and subsidies and that sort of thing can, in my experience, that's not what drives technology development. It's true pain.
No, that's a great point, Matt. Thank you. Fiona, and then Leanne, and then I have a new question.
Hello, everybody. I'm Fiona Regan from Dublin City University, and I head up the Water Institute there. And my own research area is in sensor development, and one of the areas deals with antibody-based sensing for toxins, algal toxins. But just reflecting on the discussion so far, and I'm really glad to hear Matt Clark's point there now, because my main question, I suppose, was, what is the cost of doing nothing? Because as a sensor designer, it's hugely difficult in the absence of regulation to actually get anything moved forward, and particularly in biosensing. And if we have a good regulatory market, or basis for the regulatory market, then it opens doors in terms of developing. But in terms of this field, it's really, really difficult. And others mentioned the regulatory limits are not always clear. Some target analytes are better than others, but in terms of biosensing, it's hugely challenging. But if you want to actually develop systems that can be specific, you need biosensor technology. You need antibody-based sensing, you need environmental DNA-based approaches, which are very expensive, and it takes time. And that brings me on to a point which I had a great experience working on the project with Matt Molam, led by Matt Molam. But what I noticed was Matt and NOC's focus on collaborating with industry. And I think Kevin is here as well. And I saw how technologies can move forward really well by that academic industry collaboration. Now, it's not easy, but it's really important in terms of moving things ahead. And just another point, just coming back to Zoe's work in the EU, ERICs are really important. I think European research infrastructures offer a real potential here in terms of monitoring HAB movement, because there's already some infrastructure present. There's capability in terms of data management there. There's observational expertise there. And obviously it might require more resources, but now what you have in terms of Europe at least, and there are others replicated globally, I point also to Aquatech Australia, a hugely important initiative led by the Australian government, which is looking at HAB monitoring technologies. So what I'm saying really is that we need to use existing infrastructures, existing capability, throw more resource at it. And I think coming back to Chris's point maybe at the very start is that we offer the ability to provide data as a service that can be affordable for shellfish farmers. It's really interesting to hear Matt mention the numbers in terms of finfish. And we obviously have that interest in Ireland as well. But the key is, I think, offering enough data as a service for those shellfish farmers that they can pay for it. And there's a lot of capability already out there. So look, fascinating discussion, far too many points to bring up here, but thanks for that.
Thank you, Fiona. And Leanne, you can have the last word on this thread.
Right in the beginning of this particular topic, you mentioned, would it be a priority to provide funding to the end user for the purchase or of these technologies, this equipment? And that is definitely a limiting factor, not just for the smaller family-owned shellfish farmers and aquaculture facilities, but also you know, in my prior life, I spent a decade in a regulatory agency for federally recognized tribe. And some of these smaller subsistence communities have a difficulty in purchasing capital equipment or building program capacity. So the type of funding that should potentially be considered to make available to smaller regulatory agencies would allow for A, those capital purchases, and B, continued training, because frequently smaller agencies or smaller private farms, as the initial training occurs, as staff turnover happens, they lose that institutional knowledge, and it's very difficult to gain that back.
So just for the sake of closing the circle, I know, David, you had mentioned something along these lines with remote populations. Max, you had mentioned something along this line with respect to sustaining observations. Do either of you want to layer in any last points here on the role and the value of public subsidies sustaining or catalyzing these observations? David, go ahead.
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of layers to that question. Certainly from my perspective as a funder, mostly of the research that's driving a lot of the technological innovation, but also on response to events, et cetera. You know, public sector funding always has limitations, and certainly the need is going to outstrip the amount of funds that are available, whether they're for direct capital purchases or the setting up of a robust observing network that's providing some type of data. And so really from my perspective is the challenge that we have to solve is varying users of varying capacities and capabilities to either pay for these technologies or pay for the data themselves, as well as just the sheer technological challenges of, if you're in remote Alaska, you likely are going to have limited ability to deploy many of these technologies. But really at the end of the day, it's trying to derive a model that I think leverages and utilizes capacities that we have at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level of governments, to provide possibly some level of market stabilization, but then does so in a way that incentivizes or provides a framework through which there's some either user-driven based cost recovery structure or some other type of model that allows for much easier gain of access to the data or capabilities that are driving some of these questions that folks are bringing here today. I don't pretend to have the answer yet, but I think this conversation is going a long way to helping us move and understand what that roadmap we want to start driving towards could look like to solve some of these issues.
Yeah, that's great, David. Thanks. So Max, final word. Philip, apologies in advance. We are going to take a break as soon as Max finishes up.
Yeah, just to jump on that and something Philip said earlier about like concentrating users. On the West Coast, we actually don't have that many shellfish growing bays, right? So there's very concentrated areas that could share resources. We've talked about this in California in the past, but you know, Senkus and SKUs and all the coups, I think is a good start to that. But concentrating it in the areas where people there is aquaculture, there is economic benefit, could go a long way in the subsidy train because if the government could run it and then we could, you know, manage it, I think it would be a lot easier cost-wise. But thank you.
Thanks, Max. All right, we are at 9:55 my time. I'm in the Mountain West out here. Let's take a break for 5 minutes. We will start at the top of the hour with our next session, and we're going to switch gears towards multi-sector systems. So we'll see you in 5 minutes. Welcome back, folks. All right, Casey, if you can drop that slide, we'll get going. So our next session is focused on building and supporting multi-sectoral systems for observing and monitoring. Now I'm going to jump around a little bit because there's a few threads from earlier I want to make sure we pick back up, but just some framing thoughts before we dive in. So in recent decades, the growth of global ocean observing networks, traditionally funded and maintained by governments, and sometimes in partnership with academia, has been complemented by new commercial entrants to the marketplace. And these new entrants span the entire value chain, from platforms all the way to downstream data services. And so for this next few set of questions, I'd like to focus the conversation on the roles and interdependencies between the public and private actors with respect to the HAB observing market. And to start off, I'm actually going to pull a thread that Clarissa noted in the chat. And my question is, are blue tech clusters, incubators, accelerators, entities like the US HAB, CTI, Clearinghouse, many of which receive substantial public money, are these a good way to shape and support general market growth? Or is their impact more limited to creating and growing competition within the market? And what successful examples do folks see that clusters, incubators, accelerators, clearinghouses play in forming the market in which we're all working? And Clarissa, I'll put you on the spot since I'm pulling a thread that you started if you want to jump in as well. All right, David, go ahead.
I see Dave there, so I'll circle.
Okay.
Yeah, I would mention, so we have been funding one such cluster specific to HABs. That's the US HAB Control Technology Incubator. You mentioned the CTI. It's a relatively new incubator that we've been funding and it's been off the ground for about 3 years now. And one thing I would flag with that is we recognize that eventually, and certainly one of its goals long term, will be the facilitation of transition to more of a commercial-based enterprise for control technologies specific to HABs. But in the near term, its more immediate goal was really to address technological limitations that we'd seen. Basically, a very few number of technologies that we were seeing in the marketplace that were amenable to controlling HABs in the marine environment. There's plenty in the freshwater realm, but limited advances and innovations in the marine and coastal realm. And so wanting to drive innovation both in the private, academic, and public sector as best we can. And so that specific incubator had a very particular goal to drive that innovation, but we're doing so with an eye towards, okay, at some point, once these are advanced, that we'll likely need to transition, and we'll need to do so in a way that will facilitate that more commercial-based approach that we know is going to be required. Certainly, I think observational technologies are much more advanced in the marine and coastal environment compared to control technologies, which I think is going to be the third dialogue that's discussed here in a month or so.
Right. Thanks, David. Clarissa, back over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, perhaps it's an issue of scale. I don't have a ton of experience with how these incubators have, what the endpoints are. I think I've seen them work in the demonstration phase, and I earlier mentioned in the chat as well, having some knowledge of the Jericho program in the EU, where you have this opportunity to use observing systems, usually publicly supported observing systems for industry to demonstrate, create test beds. I think that the incubators in the US can serve that same purpose, and I've seen it done for some HAB sensors, but what happens next, and I know Yuki has touched on this and others, it's that scaling problem, the niche problem, and how do you then really make that cross the valley of death into something that's sustainable from an industry perspective. And so I think that when we look at these incubators, that obviously has to be an endpoint. We've seen it in many other sectors in the US where, thinking of like solar energy and other sectors where the government invested heavily, some things failed, some things succeeded. But I think that long-term sustained investment is the only thing that's going to help cross that valley. I think that's where the pinch point has been from what I've seen, but I also don't know all the ways in which these accelerators and SBIRs sort of end up being successful or not.
So another vulnerability that's come up, Carl, go ahead.
Yeah, just to build off of that. So Carl Goldman, I'm with NOAA, National Ocean Service Integrated Ocean Observing System Office. And we're funding ocean accelerator entities right now. 4 of them just awarded 13 million plus each for 4 years of cooperative agreement work to run companies through accelerator and incubator steps to try to find markets and commercialize businesses. So I agree with everything that Clarissa said, and I do think it's definitely a scaling issue and challenge, and then fundamental public-private partnership, like what's the regime in the future that's going to work. We, in our program, have a little sliver of funding called Ocean Technology Transition, $2.5 million per year. And so that's actually helpful to try to get through that last gap in the valley of death, if you will, to transition technologies towards operations. But there's a donut hole in our operational funding to be able to run those things that we've then demonstrated, right? So we don't have an increased concomitant funding level for those things that we've now proven have a utility to specific shellfish growers, for instance. And so I rely on folks like Clarissa and the Senku's folks and the NANU's folks to be experts at putting it all together to deliver information services from our tech and sensors to meet user needs. And they do that really well. And then we demonstrate a capability, and it takes years to convince people on the public funding side that this is now viable enough and valuable enough that we need it supported for the long run. So there's institutional inertia that's hard to overcome at the same time.
Sure. So I want to sort of pull a thread, and Clarissa mentioned, this market gap, obviously this traditional valley of death, and there's other vulnerabilities in this market. So certainly over the last few years, we've all felt the pinches of supply chain issues, and particularly in this space, reagents needed for what we are trying to do. Do supply chain vulnerabilities and the requirements that folks have alluded to for this continuity of observations and system resilience affect the adoption, that front-end adoption of new technologies in the first place? And I'm assuming so. So what can be done to stabilize that supply chain so companies and consumers both see a future in this space? Chris.
One area where we've seen supply chain challenges is in the use of antibodies for algal toxin detection. And those are, it's a little bit like fine wine. You have a batch, and it only lasts so long. And the more, eventually you run out and you've got to get a new batch. And so that's been an issue that has plagued us, particularly with detecting microcystin in some freshwater systems. Just having access to the antibody, different activities, that sort of thing. So I don't really know how you solve the problem unless, when it comes to toxins, perhaps on a global scale, there's enough pull to warrant having kind of a centralized production facility for some of those types of reagents. But at a local regional scale, when you're doing small, kind of seasonal things, it's really hard to keep that supply up.
Yeah. Anybody else want to layer on Chris's point there? Okay, I'm going to pull a different thread. So Andy sent me a question before we dove in today, and I want to try and repurpose the question he shared with me. And Andy, you're going to have to hold me to account if I get it wrong. But it pulls on something that Matt and Mark have already alluded to. And we think about rapid testing kits for HAB toxins. It's certainly a growing aspect of this market. And new and small companies with limited customer bases are certainly going to be challenged by performance testing programs like AOAC runs from a cost prohibition standpoint. So what level of data quality and performance assurance is required by the customer for these kinds of tests to be deemed fit for purpose? Andy, did I get it right? That's the first point here.
Yeah, it was actually sort of one aspect of I mean, actually it links quite nicely into the last point. It's certainly a supply chain issue has been noted in the marine field as well, with the removal of the well-known Neogen test kits from the shellfish toxin monitoring market. And I suppose before we get onto the kind of the data quality and the validation quality and the fitness for purpose of the assays themselves, it's really just to sort of say there's notably a huge variety and uptake of such technologies across the globe. And I've been I should say I work at CFAS in the UK, so we're kind of the regulatory monitoring, with official control monitoring lab, but I've also been working with these immunoassays for probably close to 15 years. And in some regions of the world, for instance, notably in Scotland, they are hugely used by throughout industry that use them actively as a monitoring tool for their batch quality testing purposes, which is indeed something that's flagged in EU legislation. So food business operators should conduct their own batch quality testing for control, whereas the regulatory monitoring does the official control testing. So it's two strands of analyses. But I know for a fact, certainly in many parts of the world where the official control data is simply used by FBOs for a similar purpose. So they're not really used very much. But I suppose that's one thing, is like, but the other thing is, certainly the removal of Neogen and suddenly the market disappeared. So there were no options out there. So it's back to that last point with the antibodies, but specifically that I believe this was a commercial decision made by a commercial provider. And it really did induce kind of waves of panic through industry. So it definitely affected them. And the aftershock of that situation now is that several companies are now working on either improving and refining technologies that already existed, or are starting from scratch to develop antibodies from scratch and to develop all the reagents associated with them, and to work towards delivery of a commercial assay that would directly benefit and help not just industry, but of course all the stakeholders associated with the products they're producing. And certainly when investigating and helping the industry to assess the performance of these kits, it's quite clear there is a massive variability in the performance of these sorts of technologies that are available and out there on the market. And there's no real, other than the AOAC, of course, that have that fee-led provision of the quality stamp, the certification, performance tested methods, I think it is. Other than that, which is the fees are too costly for the majority of small industries to even think about. There's very little data out there, apart from a few notable companies that have actually gone through single and collaborative validation studies. There's little data out there that actually helps industry decide which kits to go for, which are most applicable, which are most fit for purpose, which have the performance that they're after. So lots of points there, but really just to sort of say that, yeah, I think more guidance is needed, particularly for industry, and particularly for the majority of industry that I'm aware of, that yes, they have some scientific awareness, but they do need to be led and advised by people that have a little bit more data than they have accessed themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave, Philip, and David.
So, thank you. I'm Dave Clark. I am the section manager of the Shellfish Safety Unit here in the Marine Institute in Ireland. And a bit like Philip, I wear a number of hats. My main hat is the statutory monitoring on behalf of the government agencies here in Ireland for shellfish micro and also biotoxins and HAB events. But I'm also the co-chair of the ICIS IOC working group on harmful algal bloom dynamics for the North Atlantic. Rapid test kits, a bit like Andy, I have been dipping in and out of these over the last 20 odd years. Not only do they have a really good use the food business operator level, ensuring that the product they have harvested and putting on the market is safe for human consumption. They have a really good purpose along with the statutory monitoring. So the statutory monitoring perhaps is conducted weekly, monthly. There is a time delay between the producer sending the sample, getting their test result back. In that meantime, some of these HAB events, particularly at the onset of a HAB event, can happen within hours. And all of a sudden, your shellfish, which could have been fine on a Monday, is now toxic on Tuesday. But you might not get your result back until the Thursday or the Friday, depending on the type of test which you need. Because some of these tests which are required by the EU regulatory standards are actually really complex and in-depth. Whereas if there was some kind of test kit which was easy, simple to use and to interpret by the farmer, then they have that assurance that, well, while I'm waiting, do I actually start then spending money on the logistics of harvesting the shellfish? Do I actually start contacting my clients over in Europe saying, I have product to sell, I can actually have it over to you in 2 days? And then trying to avoid all those withdrawals back when they find that the test result has come back positive. So there is a huge market in that kind of giving that assurance and confidence to the shellfish industry. Well, what's going to happen in between a HAB event? Am I going to go closed? Am I going to still remain open? Because a lot of the shellfish industry is actually on a weekly basis. It's highly competitive and they're all kind of competing for the same market. So, you know, any advantages which we can give the industry, absolutely. Some test kits have worked out really, really well. And I'm going back to the early 2000s where there was a Canadian company called Gellet Biotech and they had this PSP lateral flow assay. It was absolutely superb. And when you have a monitoring program where a lot of your PSP assays are completely negative, then it's actually saving the statutory monitoring an awful lot of money because you're not doing this complex chemical instrumentation. So I think there is still a market for, and I would encourage companies to start looking at rapid test kits. It's kind of changing a little bit. A lot of research is now focusing on lateral flow kits, looking at the gene rather than the toxin. So it's a toxin producing gene of the phytoplankton species, but that's where it's kind of going. So I think there's still an interest for this market.
I'm going to pull Yasmin up to the front and then we're going to go with Philip and David.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm Yasmin Botta. I'm a professor at the Université Côte d'Azur. So I do have, yes, also as I would say all of us, several hats, and one of them is to develop a curriculum for students, and I think maybe that's something we want to discuss also later. So working on developing curriculum on environmental hazards and option for risk management. And another involvement I have had, and with some of the persons that are present here, is I have been participating in developing early warning systems. So there has been, and it is in the document that was shared, document developed by FAO, IUC, and FAO, and then the IEA on the technical guidance for early warning systems. And in that sense, so we have been piloting this technical guidance. And of course, reducing the cost, so it's maybe more reflection than a direct answer to your question. So the providing early detection of harmful algal bloom. Well, first of all, having a rapid result on the safety of seafood is of course one of the priority, and developing early warning system is another one. And having those remote sensing as well as rapid kits is of course something that should interest not only, we have been talking a lot about the US and European countries, but thinking globally, there is a huge market globally on using those tools. There is a need to protect food safety all over the world. So that's something to keep in mind and to put forward in this discussion.
Thank you.
So that, yeah, one of the points that is important to consider.
Philip, and then David.
Yeah, just to reiterate the point Dave Clark made, the rapid test kits serve very much in limiting the damage mitigating potential costs that arise from product recalls. Because of the delays in official testing, governmental testing, which is typically weekly in Europe, you know, your companies are exposed a lot to putting potentially toxic product on the market. Either the recall costs are extortionate, or the loss in market is extortionate if an event actually happens and public safety fails, and there's no such thing as not pardoning as the market itself, you know. So if you put toxic product on the market, nobody wants to buy from you anymore, and you can probably close your company, or change your manager. So I think that there's a great market niche, but still, and this has also been outlined, the limitation is the sustainable production of antibodies to run these rapid test kits. So there's an interesting initiative, but it only works for one toxin group, which is the OC test, which actually is based on a functional assay. It could be pushed much further also for the receptor binding assays, and they have been validated in US through various schemes. Fran van Dola had been pioneering the validation of those RBA assays. So if they're, and IAEA, where Yasmin has worked, has also been very good in helping developing countries and implementing such rapid assays in official monitoring programs. So there's an array of assays out there which can be used and which are extremely helpful in limiting damage economically. Mark van Asten's approach, looking for at least the PSP toxins for the producing genes, could now be complemented also for the domoic acid, where the producing genes are now known in the microalgae. So that's certainly good advances, but I think it'll also need the additional consultation to put some public funding in, where this can eventually evolve into a good sustainable market niche. Like we have actually a lot of public funding going into a sustainable niche, which is the provision of certified standards and reference materials at the National Research Council of Canada. This is the only sustainably run facility in our HAB toxin area, where the program itself will take new toxins and new reference materials into the program once they know they can sustainably provide it at a cost-efficient way of providing it. So that's why I'm calling also for the development of new systems to be innovative and integrative systems, which they need to be sustainable. So we just need a little bit of public funding to prove that innovative systems can be sustainable. So I think that is the crux of the matter, also in the development and application or implementation of those rapid test systems.
Thank you, Philip. David, and then Mark.
Yeah, I wanted to just touch a bit on your last part of your question, Chris, around data quality, performance assurance, fit for purpose, and highlight some of the challenges we see around, how do you define that purpose? I think at a high level, this is a good example where integration or a tiered approach with more regional based observing strategies, where you have more macro scale. Okay, is there a HAB present offshore? Is there something that's popping up in the phytoplankton community that's suggestive of an issue? You then have at specific embayments or aquaculture facilities, point of use tests that perhaps could be used for screening, but have a fairly low threshold for data quality, but provide some valuable insight. I think that sort of tiered approach helps get at some of the challenges that we've been seeing around data quality, and I think can really influence how good or how not so good those can be to be valuable. But once we're talking about seafood safety, obviously in the U.S. there are programmatic and regulatory approaches both at the state level. There's the ISSC that provides some certifications for various test kits that are out there. But one of the interesting things that we're running into, and this is particularly relevant for some of those remote communities that I mentioned at the onset, who are relying on marine resources for subsistence is some of those regulatory thresholds may or may not be what I would consider, or what they would consider within their risk tolerance thresholds, particularly when you're faced as a community or as an individual with, do I eat this clam or not? And if I don't, it's a Snickers bar or nothing, because their food availability is much lower. And so those are some of the challenging dynamics that we're trying to work through, certainly from the federal side and the state side with state partners. So there's no clear answer, but it really just depends on what that exact purpose is in terms of what the level of data quality and assurance has to be.
Thanks, David. Those are great points. Mark and then Yasmin.
Right. Yeah, I from a commercial standpoint with the lateral flows, I have some personal sort of, I suppose, knowledge on the Neogen episode in assessing, I suppose, business opportunities given our investment in this area, whether or not it's molecular or toxin analysis. And I think it's that Neogen's example of withdrawing from the marketplace is a warning sign for all of us, where 10 years of effort in optimizing an assay and gaining a business hold didn't end up being commercially viable, at least for a company that could afford to drop off pieces of their business because it wasn't a focus for them. But easily, again, you're looking at a global business. Any corporation, any of the people who are in industry here are looking at how they can develop business worldwide, and little niche operations in Scotland or Australia where they adapted the Neogen kit for an application here doesn't lead itself to a sustainable business across the globe. And we're in a situation where, and technologically this is essential to do, where you have to validate on different species and different methods and different matrices. You're able to get sort of a small commercial foothold in one application, but you're then put back to assessing different matrices, different species, different application. And we've almost built up a complex pharmaceutical type operation where you get a drug and you get it for one application, but you got to go back and get a review and a clinical trial for a different one. So the market opportunity is there. To develop a commercial opportunity to being a viable business is a very complex and lengthy process.
Yasmin.
Yeah, just to go back to what Philip was mentioning. So those rapid test kits, yes, as I was also referring a little bit earlier, was this application all over the world. But it is, I mean, they will be used for local application, but also they must, of course, respond to importing countries' requirement, and they need to be validated. And I think that's the main challenge, whether they are used as test kit in a lab or as a remote sensing tool. So that's one aspect. And another major challenge also is the access to affordable toxin standard for those application of test kits. So that's 2 points that need to be, of course, highly considered. Just to, yes.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got a few minutes left in the session. I want to take an offshoot of the topic David was talking about in his answer on fit for purpose and go a slightly different direction on the data question. So we've talked a bit about, need for more and the specificity of what data needs to serve. Who is responsible for ensuring that data follows fair and care principles in this case? So this is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but also serves collective benefit. There's clear authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. Does this sit with academia and government? Does industry have a role? And on that last piece, are there commercial issues to consider with respect to how we manage and distribute data in this space? Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, so I think there are going to be applications where we probably aren't going to get fair data from some of these tests that are being taken. Particularly, I'm thinking of privately commissioned or run assessments for particular producers who might not want that information in the public domain. So I think that's where there will be a requirement for some kind of collective or governmental monitoring that can provide that that fair data, that discoverable data, because industry may not make all of their data freely available.
Good point. So
Depending on where you are in the world, there is legislation for data. So the European Union is quite advanced on this. It has Inspire for geospatial data. It has the Open Data Directive. But regardless the fact, for the last 20 years, there are a lot of resources involved in this fairness of data. I can tell you that there is a long way to go. And there is a long way to go because there is also a problem with standardization of, it's one thing to have fair data, but then you have to have standardization of collecting methodologies and observing methodologies, and you have to agree in multiple things that may impose costs, both in the observing parties and the data management agencies. So it requires a lot of consensus, a consensus from the public sector and some kind of regulation that is going to be the basis. But it requires also a lot of consensus from research institutes and from private organizations to understand that there is a common good that is going to be acquired through fair data. The only thing that I can tell you is that it's an iterative process, that it's not going to be resolved tomorrow, because also when we change the observing methodologies or when we expand what we want to observe, this kind of standards change. And the discussion opens again with a new legislation or with a new instrument or with a new methodology. I would say that there is where GOOS and other bodies that are in the observing part, and bodies like EMOTNET and like NOAA that has a federal capacity regarding data, can have a contribution by working together in the international domain, because for some things in Europe, we have managed to find solutions, but it's not only about Europe. It has to be internationally if we want to have a global understanding of the situation. So I would say that in this, we are not going to find a determined solution tomorrow, but we require a constant commitment in an iterative process.
thank you. Clarissa.
Thank you. Yeah, so much nuance that's already been touched on. I think we've recognized today the importance of the public good and public health. We may not have touched as much on yet all the different ecosystem health components to HABs that may not tie directly to a clear industry application. And I want to reference that in part because these fair practices are critical for so many even conservation efforts that may not be a part of this discussion. But, you know, on the side of nuance, we're thinking about so many different types of data. There's delayed mode, there's real time, there's backrooms, there's open rooms that the public can see or that only specialized users can see in real time, and even the HabMap community in California for monitoring. We've long talked about that. You know, what do we keep from the public in a delayed mode aspect? What do we only share with particular stakeholders in real time? Where are the sensitivities? Does all code, does all scripting, does all cyber infrastructure architecture have to be shared? No, but I think that with the federal lever behind a lot of our funding is that ultimately there has to be a public exposure of important data. And if it's needed in real time to save lives, that has to be done. If it's more about just long-term research data sets, that has to be done. But I think sometimes we get a little too excited and wrapped around the axle about this idea that everything has to be pushed out to the public all the time in real time. And that's not just in practicalities, that's just not how it works. So maybe that's where we need to structure a little bit of the conversation.
No, good point. And I think everyone has probably noticed as we go through the dialogue today, the goal is to uncover these threads. We don't always get to the end of the thread, and that's actually a feature, not a bug, in how the conversation is structured, because it's given us more to chew through as we continue on. So I'm going to take a shift here. We're going to pause for 5 minutes and take our last break. This has been a quick 2 hours, and we've got one more session in front of us. During the break, I'm going to ask folks to think about 2 questions. And when we come back, it's a free-for-all with everybody. So all 90 of us get the chance to comment and dive in, not just the 28 folks you see on screen. And so we will manage the sort of hand feature there so that everyone can get into the conversation. So the 2 questions, and I'll reframe them when we get back. The first is, are there new technologies that can bring down the cost of managing HABs? And how do we fast track promising technologies in the market? And the second is what I'm going to finish with, which is, what are the discrete recommendations, the tangible, actionable steps that you want to say that could mature the commercial market, clarify the influences on demand for technologies, and/or harmonize and synergize public and commercial scale networks? So we're going to pause for 5 minutes. We're going to come back at 40 after the hour, and we're going to dive in with the whole group. So I'll see you in a few minutes. So I'm going to start with one question before we get towards the targeted recommendation piece. And that question is, going back to the roots of today's discussion on the front end of the value chain with respect to technology. Are there new technologies that can bring down the cost of managing HABs if they're made more accessible and widely used? And what opportunities and mechanisms exist to fast track promising technology in an efficient and standardized way? And I will drop this question in the chat as well for folks to reference. Holly, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts in just this whole sort of last thought section that might be coming from academia. It's sort of related, coming from the side, but in terms of getting the information out there about the existence of these sensors, as someone in academia, I write a grant, I partner with somebody in industry, I get a sensor or a platform. We have outlined stakeholders that we're going to support during that granting program. And so we get the information out there to those stakeholders. And sometimes there are other stakeholders that come along during that process that we can interact with and showcase this particular platform. And so coming from academia, it's thinking beyond that, because we are kind of helping with marketing, right, in that particular time frame. But then past that time frame, how do we make ourselves known in our particular regions about what we have? Because we end up presenting at meetings, papers come out, that's not necessarily going to be accessed by folks at a water quality treatment plant or wherever. And so it almost becomes somewhat of a limitation in, here we have this platform that would be super useful in other use cases, and going back to the sort of the holistic look at things, if you have an imager, for example. And so how do we kind of get our voices out there to know, those folks know in our areas that we have these platforms, and that could help drive that interest and that demand. There could be sectors that we don't think about necessarily because we're in our own little topic world, but there could be things out there. And then just to piggyback on what Yasmin brought up about curriculum for students, also in terms, this is sort of a longer term view of things, but is there a way to get platforms, a limited number of platforms, either donated or loaned to particular school programs? So for example, our local community college has a certificate program for phytoplankton. And so having those loaner platforms where you're getting the next generation of trained students who are going to be going out into the workforce in downstream years, and all of a sudden they have knowledge of these platforms. Not only have they just know about them, but they've actually had hands-on. And that's sort of, the planting a seed, planting your tree now and sort of having your fruit in 5 years from now. But, you know, just thinking longer term strategies for partnering and piggybacking and maybe thinking outside the box where we can pull in these different thoughts so that we can get things, you know, get this information out there, that these platforms exist. These are how they work. These are what they can do into that next generation. And also, you know, folks that may have had grants with these platforms, you know, is there a clearinghouse for that information so that regionally folks can tap into that? So that was kind of my two thoughts, that overarching idea thoughts that I had when I was reading this last section.
Thank you, Holly. Matt, and then Yuki.
Yeah, Chris, I guess I might be looking for maybe a clarification of your question here. You talk about technologies that can bring down the cost of managing HABs, and not specifically sensors to identify HABs. So we're talking, are you referring to interventions to actually manage the bloom itself?
No, that's a good question, and we should broaden that. I shouldn't have narrowed it so tightly as to managing, but let's be all inclusive in the detection, control, managing, mitigation, the entire spread where technology can play a role.
So with that in mind, so again, you know, full disclosure, our company that's the biggest part of what we do is developing technology to manage HABs, and so the answer is yes. There are new technologies that can bring down the cost. Cost barriers are one of the most obvious challenges. You're talking about the greater environment. So managing environmental conditions is you know, putting your thumb on that scale is a very difficult challenge, and doing it in a way that's both responsible but also frankly energy efficient, because energy really factors into the number one cost in managing a situation like this. But the answer is, I would say, the answer is yes. There are new technologies constantly bringing down the cost of managing HABs. But I can say that again, our customers are exclusively in the aquaculture industry. We have dealt with some, you know, desalination customers and that sort of thing who are looking to protect their inlets for desalination plants and that sort of thing from intake of harmful algae blooms, mostly, or even just not even harmful, but just algae blooms in general that can cause problems with their processes and equipment. And so that technology, there is technologies being developed all the time. It does exist. But when it comes to mechanisms to fast track that, there is, in our experience, is that even with industries and markets that have strong financial motivators to manage HABs or manage algae blooms in general, even those customers that have a strong motivation, even today, you're still having to deal with an educational battle. So you have to explain to many customers and many users and you know, people under threat from HABs around the world that you can actually realistically manage or mitigate the effects on whatever their process is, whether it's farming, whether it's desalination, whether it's other, you know, public health considerations. But the scale is still challenging, and really one of probably the most helpful things that could be done because we strive to do this, we try to find partners in academia, government, and industry, is to establish you know, independent data and papers and results that show the actual significance or the actual quantifiable mitigation outcomes that you've achieved. You know, this is what would have happened if we didn't try to manage. This is what happened when you did, you know, attempt to manage.
Oh, thanks, Matt. So we'll go with Yuki, and then Savannah, I saw you had your hand up. If you want to jump in, please do raise your hand and I'll call on you after Yuki. Otherwise, we'll move on. So go ahead, Yuki.
I wanted to address your second point on how we can accelerate this process. And at the risk of repeating my first point, I really feel that funding and support for technology transfers would greatly accelerate this, given the complexity of the HAB problem, given the scale of the problem, and also given that there are other scientific benefits to be had for a lot of this instrumentation. I think that being able to support the technology transfer. And then in addition to that, with the nuance of realizing that the scale, it's not going to be it may not be in 6 months. It might take a year, it might take 2 years, that the scales are longer whenever you put things in the ocean. I think that would help accelerate and support getting instruments out of the lab and into industry.
Thank you. Yeah. Matt, go ahead.
So a lot of the points being made. I think from the detection point of view, yes, there's a lot happening, particularly on cost per measurement. So a number of the projects I've recently been involved with looks very promising for really bringing that cost per measurement right down with some nice bits of kit. In terms of fast tracking some of that, I think one of the key things is the technology's got to be developed for the appropriate knowledge base that's just mentioned. You know, we've tried really hard to make them very easy to use, so that the user doesn't need lots of skill in the particular measurement technique to be able to get the data that they need. And then I think the issues around market info to enable investment and to bring the commercial sectors in is really important. But we know we need to get that support for academia, SMEs, to build the market and get these technologies fast tracked.
Thanks, Matt. Mark, and then Yasmin.
Yeah, I sort of echo Matt in regards to there's a lot of things that are sort of, I suppose, new technology that is being developed. But I want to sort of, I suppose, put some focus on turning that question around, is that we spend a lot of money on testing to validate the sensitivity or the food safety aspect of it. But there's a negative predictive value as well. And if we can develop systems that sort of give a clear indication that there's no risk, maybe downstream costs of testing could actually be the cost benefits that could drive the innovation and the acceptance of these new systems.
Yasmin.
Yeah, this is the sense I wanted to go, is that the best way one way of reducing the cost of management is reducing, of course, the number of analyses, number of sampling, etc. So it's really relying on the historical knowledge of the situation in a certain region. And of course, those platforms for HAB surveillance can be a way to reduce the cost of harmful algal bloom management. So that can be a technology if, of course, they become more affordable.
Thanks, Yasmin. I'll also note in the chat, Tim has raised the point of satellite remote sensing hasn't come up in our conversation yet today, but certainly is an important angle here to consider. Dave, and then Jen.
Yeah, just as we're kind of talking about new technologies for monitoring and managing HABs, molecular has been around for a little while, but over the last couple of years, it's really come to the forefront now. And a lot of work is being developed into portable PCR kits and also testing in the field. But what we've noticed is that with the traditional techniques of identifying HAB species, particularly those which are causing toxin or maybe harmful to finfish, it takes time. It takes a specialist skill set. It's not reliant on an instrument. It's reliant on a human with taxonomic skills. And that takes time. It could take a couple of hours to analyze one sample for community analysis, whereas one day you could run a whole suite of toxins via molecular analysis on nearly 50 samples. So molecular, I think, is perhaps coming to the forefront, and I think should be supported a little bit more. Just on the point which Yasmin brings as well, early warning systems built on historical knowledge of the toxin profile and the historical HAB events which you have in your area can be really useful in identifying the certain risk periods of the year where you can target your monitoring. So if you do have extensive and expensive frequency of monitoring, you can actually use a risk-based approach saying, well, I know dinophysis only occurs at this time of year, and I might only be at risk at diuretic shellfish toxins. So I'm going to focus all my monitoring efforts this time, but I'm not going to do it another time of the year because they're just not going to happen. You can use that knowledge. And the one thing you mentioned there, just as regards satellite imagery, I mean, that's taken another leap, obviously, with hyperspectral imagery. looking at spectral signatures of phytoplankton blooms on the surface. Obviously, that's only good for those which are appearing on the surface, not those which are at depth. But again, the technology is coming up there where people are using drones or unmanned vehicles to fly with hyperspectral cameras to actually get a spectral signature so they can actually see what's happening on the surface of their water column. And when you can combine satellite imagery and hydrodynamic modeling with in situ data sets, then you
We lost your audio just on that last like 10 seconds.
I was saying when you combine in situ data and satellite data and also hydrodynamic modeling data, you've got a really good early warning system. And that's what we've been doing for our stakeholders and industry for the last decade in Ireland, is trying to bring all those monitoring pieces together. And actually going back to Maxwell's first point, the first thing he said was about the data. How can a shellfish producer or oyster farmer understand the data? How do you visualize it and put it into a certain requirement which people use? Because the way we look at data now is completely different to 2 decades ago.
Good point. Judson and then Leonardo. And you are still muted, I'm sorry.
Yeah, one thing I feel like has been coming up sort of over and over again is obviously investment. And I think the SBIR's approach is great for developing technology, but one thing that Holly and Yuki both mentioned were basically marketing. And I feel like one actionable thing here is there some sort of like consolidated market report specifically for this industry that would show, you know, current users, current technology, that you might be able to target at adopters, whether that be, you know, in industry as far as like current conglomerates or businesses that might be trying to expand.
Yeah, I like that question, Judd, and actually want to ask it back to everybody and just emphasize it. Is there sufficient market information available, especially to attract startups and new entrants in? I see a lot of heads moving, so please jump in and answer this question out loud too. And recognizing that there isn't is what I can see. What market information and what market reporting is needed? Leonardo, go ahead.
Thanks. Well, the question is difficult to have a good response on that, because there is a variety of subjects that it could be considered. If we are trying to detect a macroalgae, there are some type of technologies. If biotoxins are different technologies, then if we include into that system the size of the geographic area where you are working, and also the kind of toxins and macroalgae that are affecting your area, and also you should consider the productive area if you have aquaculture, or if there are some natural beds that have been important for the commercial point of view. So in that case, when we are trying to incorporate these new technologies, I think in the first steps, the cost will be much higher, but it's the only way to incorporate this technology. Because in the first step of this technology, also you should adapt the technology to the local conditions where you're working. And considering, as an example, metabart coding and molecular tools for identify a huge number of species. The technology is available, but when you try to identify the total amount of DNA present in your samples, probably you will have success to the 40 or 50%. The rest is impossible to know what you are working with, because the libraries are not good enough. So you must build new starters and try to build your library, and that will, for doing that, you will spend a lot of money, a lot of time, but you must invest that time and that financial support, because it's the only way to try to move from the traditional system that has been said previously. It takes a lot of time. You need trained people and so on. So from that point of view, I think we must try to manage these subjects, joining the different way of thinking, different way of trying to solve this subject in international terms, in global terms, as a way to move not simultaneously, but at least moving in the same direction, as a way to have in 5 or 10 years more a much better technical support and a much better information for taking reliable and in-time decisions for protecting the quality of seafood or trying to diminish the effects over some specific productive areas as fish kills in cages and so on.
Thank you. Mark, Matt, and Fiona.
Yeah, on that subject of data sharing or reports or processes in trying to sort of market a technology or otherwise, there was always the ETV process that was defunct now out of the US. There is a NOAA-supported process called the Alliance Coastal Technology, which we went through the process, and it was a very transparent and very rigorous sort of process, generates reports on technologies and sensors that could be used in the field. But then it's very sort of discouraging that people aren't aware of that process or don't access that sort of data as far as utilization of the results of that. But I would encourage, some sort of process or consensus of where companies can actually validate their technologies in the field for assessment globally.
Matt?
So coming back to your point about market information, having pitched to try and get funding from both public bodies and from venture capital a number of times, I think one of the things we could improve on is the market report information that's aimed at those target audiences. So this community that we've got here together probably could put something like that together that's pretty comprehensive, and pick up what's already out there available publicly. But we do need better market size information, breakdown of the sectors, the adjacent markets, looking at the regulations and the standards, competition, what's already out there, and current techniques, best practices, and all of that side of things as well. But also a realistic analysis of how conservative some of these markets are and what the routes to market might be. That would be great to have. It's quite an undertaking to create it.
It's a fantastic recommendation, though. Fiona, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Just coming back, I suppose, to the development of technologies and seeing where the market is for those. I suppose, and again, I'm academic, so I may be completely wrong in saying this, but what we're talking really around is more developing decision support tools. And in that, we have already brought up the need for incorporating satellite data. And again, I point to Aquawatch Australia, who are doing this for HABs monitoring, and the aerial monitoring that was mentioned, and the in situ. And for that decision support solution, we need machine learning capabilities. So it's not, I think when we say we give sensors to aquaculture farmers, I think is simplifying it too much. It's very difficult to hand a sensor that requires maintenance and knowledge around operation to a farmer without really providing them with sufficient information and background, because that sensor has a finite lifetime as well. So I think really to consider a broader look at this in providing decision support tools is really important. If that can also provide early warning systems. So if we don't have, let's say right now, very specific sensors for toxins, we can use existing technologies to give us early warning systems for the onset of a bloom, for example, which I think is really valuable as well. So that whole idea of a multimodal solution might seem complex, but it's already existing for certain scenarios, for environmental monitoring, for a whole range of different applications. So I think really when we're talking about market, there's potential market here for developing new modeling systems as well. We're not just developing new markets for sensors for harmful algal blooms. There's real linked opportunities here. And I think those companies maybe who are interested in operating in the marine environment could see real advantage in working with aquaculture farmers, with sensor developers. So I'm probably making this very complex, but I see a solution as being a multimodal solution rather than handing an individual sensor to an aquaculture farmer. Thanks.
No, thank you. And I love that we're sort of now shifting into these pointed recommendations. And so I'm going to ask my last set of questions for the day, and then we will see where this conversation takes us. The question is, recognizing that these dialogues are aimed at uncovering targeted recommendations, I want folks to think through a few pieces, and really this is a sort of share your final thoughts, make sure that what you wanted to get captured gets captured. What recommendations can you share that serve to mature the commercial market for HAB technologies, advance new technologies and methods, clarify and aggregate demand for these technologies, and or harmonize and synergize HAB observing networks to serve public good? And I'll drop this in the chat too, so folks can reference it. And this is for everybody, all 80 of us, whether you're on the panelist or attendee side. I'd love to have your input. Michael.
First, just thanks everyone for this great discussion today. I think kind of picking up on the question, but also Fiona's last points. I really think there's a huge opportunity to start thinking about where we put the onus on sharing data, and sort of when we think about these public-private partnerships, having a real concerted investment about setting the framework for all these different sensors to share data in ways that are very sort of discoverable, and that we're building skills in our students and junior folks that are transferable as they try to access data from different sources in different places. And I think another part of that solution is to really put more onus on our sensor developers to really pave the last mile. And by that I mean for data to be shareable publicly on the internet and accessed very easily through the internet by default, so that it's not like an engineering effort for every person that's trying to adapt or adopt a new sensor as part of their observing system or their farm or whatever it might be. So I think that's a huge opportunity in this sort of cost savings and promoting sort of a healthy public-private partnership in this space.
Thanks, Michael. Leonardo.
Thanks. I think to improve the how to get in touch with these new technologies, I think one probably good idea is to use the international conferences associated to marine toxins or harmful algae as a way that the private and the public sector and academia, and including the producer of this new technology, get in the same place and interact and have a knowledge of this new technology in global terms, not so localized areas. In some countries, this technology is available very easily, very rapidly, but in other parts of the world, you need to share some spaces. And in these international conferences, you could have a stand, 2 or 3 stands with new technology, and then you could have some workshops and the direct interaction into the probably user of this technology, and as the way you have to open the market to use these new techniques that could be useful for management and monitoring activities and even for science.
Thank you, Leonardo. I see a lot of good things coming into the chat, so please do keep dumping ideas into the webinar chat. There's also a couple that have come up under the Q&A, so if folks want to reference those, please feel free. This is an open question though, so anybody's welcome to jump in. If you have thoughts you want to make sure are recorded, now is a great time to capture them. I will take silence as happiness. So I want to thank everyone for an incredibly rich discussion today. I know there's a lot of topics, a lot of threads, a lot of points that were raised. I know we didn't get in depth on everything, but this is the first of 3 conversations. So we will continue this discussion. I'm going to invite Stenka back up and pass the baton to her to give us an overview of what comes next in this series. And I look forward to seeing you all again later. Thank you.
Great. Let me echo Chris's thanks. You all have been an amazing panel, and we really appreciate all of your efforts. As Casey brings the slides up, the last couple of slides, this doesn't happen without a lot of help and participation, certainly from the Ocean Enterprise Initiative. That is an MTS, GOOS, NOAA, IUCE with our industry partners, Kongsberg Discovery and L3 Harris. But we have the organizing committee that you see there, who have worked very, very closely to put together the background paper and the curated paper. So I wanted to really say thank you. So what happens immediately next is a report will be generated from this dialogue. You should receive it on Tuesday of next week. We'll give you a week to provide comments, and then we will finalize the report from this dialogue. Next slide, please. As we've said, there are 2 subsequent dialogues that are happening. The one on the 29th of January, want to have the first report completed before that dialogue, and then the final dialogue on the 12th of February. We have been busily inviting folks to act as panelists for the 29th and the 12th, but we certainly encourage any of you who participated today to participate in our upcoming dialogues, and please pass the word. Each of these dialogues will be on the Ocean Enterprise and the GOOS websites. Each report will be there, and at the end of the 3rd dialogue, a synthesis report will be generated, and we are looking to get that all completed ahead of Ocean Business, which happens in April of this year. So with that, again, thank you very, very much for all of your conversations, all of your recommendations. On behalf of the entire Ocean Enterprise Initiative, have a wonderful either rest of your morning, rest of your afternoon, or the middle of the night for some of you. So thank you. And I think that concludes this dialogue.
Thank you.